The end of world war II did not signal the end of its darkest legacies. As Europe began the arduous task of rebuilding, an unsettling question lingered. What happened to the priceless art looted by the Nazis? Thousands of stolen paintings, sculptures, and treasures lay hidden in secret vaults, warehouses, and bunkers across the continent, their fate is uncertain. Some were recovered, but many were lost to time, hidden by those who sought to profit from their theft or escape justice altogether. The recovery efforts, spanning decades, have been slow and complicated, an ongoing battle for ownership, restitution, and the return of cultural identity. The chaos of war doesn't end when the guns fall silent. Even as the world began to rebuild in the wake of World War II, something else was left in its wake, the remnants of a darker, more complex story. Across the occupied countries of Europe, Nazi forces had plundered tens of thousands of priceless artifacts. These treasures, paintings, sculptures, ancient manuscripts, and jewels, were seized with an unrelenting thirst for conquest, but also to fuel the regime's imperial fantasies. When the war ended, these objects, among the greatest cultural losses in history, were left in limbo. The question that lingers today: what really happened to the stolen artifacts from Nazi-occupied countries? In the immediate aftermath of Germany's defeat, Europe found itself steeped in devastation and an unfamiliar quiet. There were no bombs falling, no armies marching, but the world felt far from peaceful. The staggering scale of the war's destruction left governments scrambling to piece together shattered economies. It was not only the physical landscapes that needed rebuilding. Entire societies and their cultural legacies had been obliterated. The war had ripped open the fabric of European culture, and with it, the theft of its history. The treasures that had once graced the walls of museums, the halls of palaces, and the collections of private collectors were now scattered across the continent. In Berlin, Paris, Rome, Vienna, and beyond, these stolen pieces lay hidden, awaiting an uncertain fate. Among the most significant actions taken immediately after the war was the establishment of Allied efforts to track down and return looted art. As the Nazis retreated, they had carried off vast quantities of stolen goods. These were either sent back to Germany or hidden in warehouses and caves across occupied Europe. The Allied forces, upon advancing into enemy territory, were faced not just with the liberation of people but also with the grim task of recovering what had been taken. Yet, the numbers were staggering. It is estimated that between 20,000 to 100,000 works of art were looted during the Nazi occupation, an astronomical amount that no single army could simply return in a day. In the chaos of liberation, many countries faced another dilemma. Their own war efforts had drained their resources, and the priority was rebuilding infrastructure, not safeguarding stolen art. Some of the art looted from countries like France, Poland, and Belgium was recovered quickly, but much of it had disappeared into the depths of warehouses or hidden in secret locations. In some cases, entire collections had vanished without a trace. For nations like France, the thefts were personal, each lost painting or sculpture a direct affront to their national heritage. Yet, despite the widespread desire to recover their treasures, there was little infrastructure or expertise in the immediate post-war years to properly handle such an enormous operation. One of the most immediate issues was the sheer scale of the problem. Art was not simply stolen. It was systematically catalogued, bartered, and even sold. The Nazis, under the guise of their propagandist fantasies, had not only seized treasures for their cultural purposes, but had also turned the theft into a profitable enterprise. Pieces were sold on the black market, while others were hoarded by key figures within the Nazi leadership. When Allied forces moved in, they discovered extensive networks of looting, with stolen pieces strewn across Europe and further hidden away in secret Nazi bunkers. The Monuments, Fine Arts and Archives (MFAA) division, more popularly known as the Monuments Men, was tasked with recovering some of these lost treasures. It was a delicate and often frustrating effort. These soldiers, curators, and scholars worked tirelessly through rubble and war-torn cities to recover works from museums, banks, and private estates. But as quickly as they found one piece, more were discovered elsewhere. In many cases, the retrieval of stolen art involved enormous diplomatic negotiations. What was the rightful ownership of a painting looted from a Jewish family in Poland? How could a statue taken from a church in Italy be returned, when the war had left borders redrawn and political situations in flux? The questions were as complex as the recovery efforts. Countries were reluctant to surrender what they could claim, and many were more concerned with securing economic aid and rebuilding their cities than they were with the return of stolen cultural property. In fact, the urgency of post-war reconstruction meant that many pieces were overlooked, ignored, or delayed in the process of repatriation. Meanwhile, as governments wrestled with how best to return these artifacts to their rightful homes, many individuals within the Nazi regime were also seeking to escape justice. Some had secured a future for themselves in South America or through the protection of sympathetic political regimes. These individuals, many of them key figures in the Nazi art theft operation, carried their ill-gotten goods with them. A significant number of art pieces remained in private collections, where they were hidden, sold, or stored in secrecy. As the years passed, a combination of legal and cultural pressures led to the formation of committees and organizations designed to find and return stolen artifacts. The 1990s saw significant progress, thanks in part to new advances in technology that allowed for the tracking and verification of looted art. However, the process was never simple. Some pieces remained elusive, lost to history, or hidden in private collections for decades. Even today, entire inventories of Nazi-looted art remain unaccounted for, buried in secret corners of the world. Yet, the larger question remains, how can cultural property ever truly be returned? The system of restitution is far from perfect, as the ongoing battles over ownership show. These artifacts, stripped from their original homes, are now embedded in the histories of the countries that recovered them. But the sense of loss, not just to the nations but to the world, is deep. In many ways, these works of art are irreplaceable. They can never fully recover the significance they held before they were stolen. The economic costs of recovery are still felt today, with some pieces lost forever, while others remain locked in complex webs of legal battles. Though many have been returned, the cultural impact of the thefts lingers on. The aftermath of this vast plundering remains one of the great unresolved tragedies of the post-war era. A loss that cannot be measured merely in monetary terms but in the disappearance of an entire world's heritage. The recovery and restitution of Nazi-looted art in the years following World War II proved to be as tangled and complex as the thefts themselves. While some nations managed to swiftly recover their stolen treasures, the full scale of the thefts was only fully realized decades later. By the 1950s and 1960s, the post-war economic landscape had shifted, and nations were beginning to refocus on their own reconstruction. But the fate of the plundered art had taken on a different urgency. What began as an effort to return looted artifacts to their rightful owners slowly morphed into a struggle over ownership, legality, and the historical significance of the stolen pieces. After the war, many countries were too financially burdened to devote significant resources to recovering art. The Soviet Union, for instance, had its own goals in mind. Instead of returning art looted from countries such as Poland and Hungary, the Soviet authorities seized many pieces for themselves, transporting them back to Moscow and hiding them in vaults. In the West, countries like France, Italy, and Germany were eager to recover their stolen treasures but faced bureaucratic challenges and the difficulty of establishing true ownership, particularly when many of the original owners had perished in the war or been displaced. Yet even in the immediate aftermath, the cultural and political value of recovering stolen art was not lost on the Allies. The monument's men, those tasked with retrieving looted art, had a clear moral directive. They were not just soldiers and curators, but protectors of civilization. For them, the repatriation of looted art was not merely an economic or logistical task. It was a form of restitution. But the task was monumental. Many pieces had been so widely scattered and hidden that their location was often unknown, and the sheer volume of stolen art made it difficult to prioritize. Some art, however, found a way back to its rightful place more easily. For example, the famous Ghent altarpiece, stolen by the Nazis and hidden in a salt mine, was recovered relatively quickly. Other pieces, such as The Lady with an Ermine by Leonardo da Vinci, which had been stolen from Poland, were recovered and returned in a similar fashion. Yet these success stories were far from the rule. As the years progressed, the complexities only deepened. Restitution committees began to form, such as the Dutch Restitution Committee, which sought to resolve claims over art stolen from the Netherlands, but their work was slow and hampered by shifting political allegiances and diplomatic hurdles. In some instances, the ownership of the stolen artifacts became as contentious as their theft. Take, for example, the case of the Elgin marbles, which had been removed from Greece in the 19th century and later sold to the British Museum. The debate over their rightful ownership had been long-standing, but it took on new intensity as more and more pieces were recovered from Nazi vaults, igniting calls for the return of cultural artifacts to their original homes. The aftermath of the war forced many to confront the uncomfortable reality that nations had long been complicit in the thefts or misappropriations of art. As the decades passed, the slow process of restitution continued. By the 1990s, technological advancements, including databases and digitized records of stolen art, had made the recovery process more efficient. Advances in provenance research allowed scholars to trace the origins of paintings, sculptures, and other cultural objects with greater accuracy, making it possible to link stolen works to their original owners. The 1998 Washington Conference on Nazi-confiscated art marked a turning point in the restitution process, with more than 40 countries agreeing to establish guidelines for the return of looted art. This formalized the recognition of the legal and ethical obligation to return cultural property to its rightful owners. Yet, despite these efforts, a large portion of the stolen art remains missing. In many cases, pieces that had been taken from Jewish families during the war were passed through multiple owners, often hidden in private collections for decades, making it nearly impossible to track their origins. This created a distinct challenge, as it was not only necessary to prove ownership but to also prove that the piece had been stolen in the first place. Adding to the complexity was the fact that many works had been destroyed or damaged beyond recognition. Some pieces, ironically, were so well hidden that their location is still a mystery. In one famous instance, the Nazi regime had hidden a vast collection of stolen art in salt mines in Austria and Germany. These treasures, including works by Rembrandt, Vermeer, and Van Gogh, were stored in crates for nearly a half-century before being uncovered. However, many pieces were so damaged by their years of hiding that their original beauty was permanently marred. The discovery of these works, though exciting, served as a reminder that the physical legacy of Nazi theft had been severely damaged by the ravages of time, neglect, and war. What's more, by the time restitution efforts gained momentum in the 1990s and 2000s, the situation had shifted dramatically. The number of surviving relatives or rightful heirs of looted artworks had dwindled significantly, and the complexities of international law and ownership claims became increasingly difficult to resolve. Many stolen works had already entered the public domain, their ownership long established by museums and collectors who had purchased them, sometimes in good faith, from dealers who had no knowledge of their provenance. The emergence of these long-buried histories sparked a reckoning in the art world. Should museums return works that had been purchased legitimately, even if they had once been stolen? Was it fair to ask museums to give up valuable pieces that had been part of national collections for generations? The problem of restitution had no easy answers, and as time marched on, the desire for closure continued to meet obstacles. In some countries, national governments worked closely with restitution committees, while in others, efforts were bogged down by bureaucracy, political divisions, and competing claims. The International Council of Museums, ICOM, and other cultural organizations became critical in shaping the debates surrounding ownership, ethics, and restitution. The creation of specific laws, such as the 1995 French law on the restitution of looted art, helped clarify how nations could manage restitution efforts. While much of the art recovered in the post-war years had been returned to its rightful owners or their descendants, the true costs of the Nazi art thefts cannot be measured solely in terms of material loss. The cultural legacy of the war's plundering is a slow-burning wound. In many cases, the loss was not just of individual pieces but of entire collections. The grand libraries of Europe, once filled with centuries of knowledge, were ransacked and dismantled. Private collections, carefully curated over generations, were destroyed or dispersed. The loss of cultural heritage during the war was not simply a matter of the absence of beautiful objects, but the erasure of entire histories. The international art market itself was transformed by the war's aftermath. The rise of illegal art trading and the proliferation of forgeries meant that the line between legitimate art and stolen art became more blurred. Art dealers and auction houses faced growing scrutiny as it became evident that Nazi-looted works had, in some cases, found their way into the market and were being sold to unsuspecting buyers. As the decades passed, some pieces found their way into private collections and museums with little more than a paper trail to prove their origins. Despite the many successes in recovering looted art, the aftermath of Nazi thefts remains a complex, unresolved issue. Some argue that the passage of time should not diminish the moral responsibility of countries and institutions to return stolen art. Yet, as the years pass, and with each legal battle and claim of ownership, the road to restitution grows more complicated. The challenge, as ever, is finding a balance between legal ownership, historical justice, and cultural restitution. Ultimately, the fate of the stolen artifacts from Nazi-occupied countries is a reminder of the enduring consequences of war. The act of stealing art during the war was not just an effort to secure material wealth, but an effort to dismantle the cultural identities of entire nations. The recovery of those works is ongoing, and the story of those that remain hidden in vaults, scattered across private collections, or lost to time continues to be written. Through this history of recovery and loss, the question lingers: how can art, once stolen, ever truly return to its rightful place? Even as restitution efforts continue, the stolen treasures that remain locked in the vaults of history offer a stark reminder of the deep scars that war leaves behind, scars not just on the body, but on the spirit of a culture, and the very notion of what is lost when history itself is stolen.